In this video, I sat down with author and world-class endurance coach, also my coach since 2019, Coach Gareth Thomas. We discussed everything you need to know about lactate testing, and then how he uses that data to create a science-based training plan.
If you like what you see here, please hit the subscribe button below to be the first to know about new videos and free premium content.
I've heard a lot about lactate testing. I've done it with you for the last 3 years. Lionel Sanders just put out this YouTube video of him doing lactate testing going into the 2024 season. The Norwegians seem to do it like every training session. So I'd love to hear your explanation of what lactate is, just on a basic level. Just start base knowledge, and then we'll start getting into a little bit more in-depth on testing and that kind of stuff.
So lactate at its most basic level, we produce it all the time and we use it as a fuel. As you exercise at harder, more high intense efforts, it will rise in the blood, and then it's associated with fatigue and not being able to sustain the effort you're working at. So we just need to measure those points, because we can learn thresholds, we can learn training zones from knowing different levels of lactate in the blood and associate that with your training correctly.
So is that thing when say you're doing a mile or like running the 800, right, on a track, it's when your muscles just start burning and you feel like you can't turn them over quickly enough? That's the chemical lactate building up in your muscles?
So you know when you're sore the next day after you've worked out and everyone says, oh, I'm full of lactate. No, you're not. Your body's processed all that. That's gone. But when you're an 800 on the track is a great example, right? Because that's at least a 2-minute effort, right?
Yeah.
And it's hard, fast, and it's really you're wrecked at the end of it. So that's definitely a time when lactate will build super fast in the blood, and your ability to tolerate that lactate and to a certain degree not produce that much lactate will determine your success over that distance. But that 800 is still a largely aerobic event. It's middle distance in running. So 800s, 1500s, that's middle distance. And lactate tolerance, lactate clearing, the ability to not even produce much when you're working fast is all part of an efficient aerobic system. Anaerobic is, think of anaerobic as 1 minute or less. Think of weight training as purely anaerobic. Think of 200 meters on the track, that's anaerobic. But 800, 1500, 5K, those are aerobic sports. And that middle distance area is really tricky for coaching, because you do have such a blend of the aerobic and anaerobic systems working together because of the pace involved. But typically the longer the sport, 5K, 10K, half marathon, it becomes largely aerobic, and it becomes a lot simpler actually to train. So what I want to do and what I want to gain most from a lactate test is to understand how somebody is metabolically built. So at its simplest level, we're hybrid engines, right? We have an aerobic system and an anaerobic system. Think of aerobic as low levels of lactate. Think of anaerobic as higher levels of lactate. And of course, being a hybrid, they kind of work together. And you can see that in different sports. So if you look at just the world of cycling, there are people who sprint really well, more anaerobic skill, and those are those that time trial and climb really well, more aerobic skill. So even within a sport, you can kind of tune these two skill sets, these two metabolic makeups, this aerobic and anaerobic, to be the perfect blend for what it is you're trying to do. So obviously even a mountain biker has a different makeup than a road cyclist, because they have a different type of event. So you're looking at this hybrid engine and working out how to maximize it. And so lactate is just taking away all the sort of depth of why scientists think about lactate, but it's a great marker for aerobic efficiency and anaerobic efficiency. So if you measure it, you know exactly what's going on with both energy systems, and then you can tune it.
Are there athletes where physiologically they're just built to do more of the high-end anaerobic, whereas some people are more built to do the aerobic? And then if that is the case, how do you adjust those?
Okay, so definitely athletes are genetically built. So things like your VO2, your engine, the size of your engine, you're kind of either born with the Ferrari or the Audi or the Ford Focus. Like, that's just your parents and your genetic history. You can tune that engine as best possible through great training and understanding it. But if you've got a VO2 of 58, it's never going to translate to a VO2 of 90. It's just fact. So there's that. That's the size of the engine. But when you look at the athletes, you look at muscle fibers. So you look at sprinters. great muscle density, more power, more explosion. That's often in the muscle fiber type, and then the training, they're more predisposed to sprint and move fast.
And that's the fast twitch versus slow twitch muscles, that kind of thing.
And that's an efficient anaerobic system, which typically will produce lactate quickly. And then the endurance athletes generally produce low lactate levels because their body is very efficient at just metabolizing it. But the best way to look at it as a user is low lactate, super aerobic, high lactate, super anaerobic. How do I blend those for my sport?
So we're doing this lactate testing specific for triathlon because that's the sport that I'm doing. But I've seen this also in biking, swimming, running. What sports use lactate testing as a measurement?
I've tested a lot of people across all different sports. So my focus is anything endurance. Swimming, cycling, running, cross-country skiing is a big use of this. Even tennis players, anything that has an aerobic effort, soccer players, things where endurance is required. So if you look at the conditioning and fitness of tennis players and football, English football players, it's a superb level of fitness. Now they're playing 90 minutes, that's an aerobic sport, and they've got to sprint, recover, and keep going. So this is really relevant for anyone who's doing anything endurance-wise.
I want to talk about zones because there's a lot out there about zones, and I feel like they're not all talking about the same thing. And then one of the things, having done this test with you before, that you get is you start to get your zones, and they're like lactate zones. So I guess I want to start off with just a overall talk about zones and what they are and what it means.
So the purpose of training zones is to be able to hone in and focus on developing a certain part of your physiology, and to have a clear focus that when you're doing a training session in a set zone, you're developing this component of you. So there's the classic zones would be zone 1 is more like recovery. Classic zone 2, aerobic endurance. Zone 3, kind of tempo or advanced conditioning, advanced aerobic endurance. Zone 4 is like threshold. We'll talk about threshold more. And zone 5 and above is that sort of VO2 and power training.
So the zone 2 that you always hear Peter Attia talking about is that aerobic sort of base level.
Exactly. It's the most important zone really for anybody for fitness. Because, and this is where you see like things like the 80-20 rule, 80% of your time doing endurance work and 20% harder work. It crosses over from world-class athletes to sort of beginner athletes. We are aerobic beings put on this planet. Movement like walking, running is aerobic. And a lot of people, their first introduction to sport is sort of torture. They do PE at school and they're made to run really fast, or they're made to do sports at high intensity, and they just don't like it because it's way out of their zone 2. So they experience the sort of tolerance, suffering part of sport really early. And they never develop this solid aerobic fitness. So when people can find their proper zone 2, that's when they find the joy of exercise. It's comfortable, they can do a lot of it, it doesn't hurt so much, and it has real rewards, real big benefits, and setting like the benchmark and the basis for all the speed that will come later.
Can you explain the different zones that we end up with after we test and sort of what that means for training?
Right, so we're really looking to, there's 2 main zones I'm looking to identify. The zone 2, this aerobic endurance zone, right? And then threshold. Threshold being that last intensity you can operate at and sustain that intensity before you start to break down.
That's like race pace?
It depends on the sport.
Okay.
So marathon race pace is different than 5K race pace.
True, yeah.
So it depends. So typically, this is very formulaic, but I've done thousands and thousands of tests, right? So what you typically find is less than 2 millimoles of lactate in the blood is typically where we put endurance zone 2. And classically, around 4 millimoles of lactate in the blood is where we typically put threshold. Now, everything's a bit different. Like yours is a bit different actually because your lactate is generally a little higher in your blood because you also peak out at fairly high lactate levels. So you've got a bit more of a fast twitch fiber component to you as a person. So your lactate levels aren't super low at any point, but you peak out at like 11.5, which is quite high. So you start at 1.5 and finish at 11.5. Me as an endurance runner my whole life, my lactate is like 0.7, and I might finish at 8 millimoles of lactate because I just haven't developed that speed part of my physiology in many years. So everyone's got a different sort of setup. But classically, below 2 millimoles is kind of zone 2, around 4 threshold. But you look at the curve, you look at the shape of the curve and the whole picture to determine zones.
Since we've tested before, the zones we end up with, you call them, and I don't know, is this universal or is this just your terminology? But I know it's Aero, LT, AC, SST, and then VO2. So what do those mean?
Well, if you think about it, most people when they're training, they don't know what they're doing. They don't know why they're in a certain zone. So me as a coach, my goal is, you know that when you're in the aerobic zone, aero, you're training your aerobic endurance. You can attach to it a phrase that makes sense to you. When you're training in your SST zone, your steady state threshold zone, you know from me that that's the zone where we're going to train threshold to have sustainable pace, steady state. So the words are designed for my zones to take away the general theories that are out there and to get really specific based on your lactate data. So we have an aerobic zone, which is easy, extensive endurance. We have an LT zone, which is, I think other people would call aerobic threshold or LT1. It's that sort of first shift away from easy training. It's kind of moderate. It's kind of intensive endurance.
And from a lactate standpoint, that's like the first little inflection point where your lactate starts to creep up a little bit?
Yeah, just a touch away from a steady baseline probably.
Okay.
But it's different for every person. You have to read each graph, right? Then we have a zone I call AC, aerobic conditioning or advanced conditioning, which is that tempo zone. It's a harder effort, it's sustainable, and you can associate that maybe with a race. And then SST is that interval zone, and then VO2 is anything that's focusing on developing pure speed.
Okay, so SST, which is steady state threshold, would that essentially be the same thing as FTP, or are those two things different?
So FTP is a system used by cyclists to try and give people without access to a lab an idea of where to set their threshold.
And FTP, just for anyone who doesn't know, stands for functional threshold power, right?
Yeah, and it does, and it's a great test actually. It's a great field test. So for example, let's take it, let's put it into the real world. The way their theory works is, in month 1, for 20 minutes, you can hold 200 watts on a bike. That's your marker, and we're going to set that as your threshold and give you training based on that. Month 2, you're fitter, you can hold 210 watts. So you're fitter, aren't you? I would say, well, you can perform better, but we don't know what's fitter about you.
Yeah.
We don't know if you've got a better aerobic system.
Or maybe you've just gotten better at doing the FTP tests.
Or you can tolerate things more. You're more motivated. You felt better that morning. So FTP is not something we use to set training zones, not at all. It's a great marker for how are you performing. Because obviously, if in month 1 you can produce 200 watts, and month 10 you're producing 250 watts in 10 minutes, you're fitter. Same, and you're faster, you're happier. Same as on the run. If you can run at 7-minute mile in month 1 for 20 minutes, and in month 2 you can run at 6-minute mile, that's better. But we don't know what's better, so I wouldn't base training on that. I would just use that as an idea of you as an athlete becoming a more complete athlete, that you can now perform. So instead, what we want to know is, if in month 1, at 200 watts, you're at 4 millimoles of lactate, if in month 2, at 200 watts, you should be, in theory, lower lactate because you're more aerobically fit. You should be 3.5. That's a metabolic gain, a metabolic aerobic gain. You're producing less lactate at 200 watts. That's where the lab and lactate becomes really scientific. Because you could also have a situation, instead of being able to hold 200 watts now for 20 minutes, you can hold 220. 200 watts, remember, was 4 millimoles of lactate.
Yeah.
If 220 is 4 millimoles of lactate, then you'll say, hey, for 4 millimoles of lactate, I've got 20 more watts. But if in month 2, 220 watts costs you 5 millimoles of lactate, it's not more efficient, you're just working harder and able to suffer it. So you can't assume more power or more pace is aerobically fitter. That's why we have the laboratory to measure specifics of how you're built, and then we have field tests to tell us how you're actually performing.
So last question about the zones. LT1, which we call LT when we're doing our training zones, that's the first stage where your lactate starts to tick up. And then LT2, which we call SST, steady state threshold. Yeah. That's really where your lactate levels sort of exponentially start to increase, where beyond that, you're not able to sustain that for a long period of time. Is that right?
I like to think of it like this, and this is why we can't really say it's at a set point. What we're trying to do, and this is what the Norwegians really want to do, they want to identify lactate steady state, meaning that point where if you stay at that power output or pace, the lactate will not rise. So you're looking for the maximal lactate steady state. Let's say threshold, say zone 4 in classic terms for most people watching this stuff, steady state threshold in our world or lactate threshold in other people's world. Let's say that's 4 millimoles of lactate and a set pace. That means if we keep you going at that set pace, the lactate's going to stay at that lactate level. But if we went faster, just a bit faster, the lactate's going to continually rise, even though you're staying at the same power or pace. That's a problem, right? So if you think about racing, if you're doing a 25-mile bike ride, and we think your threshold, we know your threshold's 200 watts, and you're at 4 millimoles of lactate and you're riding, you can sustain that power and that pace. And you'll get off the bike at 4 millimoles of lactate, able to run well. Let's say you ride though at 220 watts. So you start at 4 millimoles, 4.5, 5, 6, 7. When you get off that bike, you're no longer in steady state. You can't run to your potential.
So, and that's what we call overbiking.
Yeah,
right?
That's what I call overbiking, or the people biking beyond their conditioning. In the marathon, it's called the wall. The wall in the marathon doesn't exist unless you create it for yourself. It's really practical. Think about this. If you run too fast and you don't fuel the marathon, you run out of energy and the ability to sustain it. If you run in the right zone and you fuel it with the right sodium, water, and carbohydrates, there's no such thing as a wall in a marathon. Otherwise, people wouldn't be running 200-mile races. Like, it's a self-created phenomena. So testing takes away all that. You just know how to train and how to race.
Part of the lactate testing that we do, in addition to getting the lactate numbers, is also getting the heart rate data. So why is heart rate important to capture in the lactate test? And then why is it important in training?
So there's a lot of talk out there right now that everyone's got power meters or they can measure pace by GPS through training. So why do we need heart rates? It's old technology. It's still really, really important. Just think of the basics. When you're calm and you're relaxing, your heart rate's low. When you're stressed and you're under fight or flight or sprinting, your heart rate's high. Heart rate's a great sign of the stress your body's under. So if it's hot out, your body's under more stress than when it's cool out. There's loads of reasons why heart rate's a really important factor. We use it as one factor mixed with other factors. So on the bike, you would look at heart rate in conjunction with power. On the run, you look at heart rate with pace to judge how a training session is affecting you. Now, my theory is for all the easy training, I don't care about power or pace at all. I only care about heart rate because I'm trying to get the athlete into a low stress, high fat burning state. So I want them to be lower heart rate so they can access fats for energy. So zone 2 training for me, only heart rate based. And over time, what you should see in zone 2 is more power and pace as you get fitter over the months.
Same heart rate, higher power, faster pace, basically.
And then if we're training like, say, threshold and above on the bike and run, then we focus on pace or power, because what we're doing is then we're trying to get the intensity right. Think about it. If you're doing, say, a set of 2-minute intervals, heart rate's not going to rise enough in that 2 minutes to give you a true intensity factor. Whereas power is exact. You jump on, your threshold's 250 watts. You ride at 250 watts for 2 minutes, take a minute recovery. We've chosen that 250 watts or whatever it is based on your lactate data and your personal test. And then we're also using heart rate as a measure over time as to whether it's less stressful to produce that power. Here's an example. Day 1, you ride for 10 minutes at 250 watts. Your lactate's 4 and your heart rate's 150. A month later, do the same thing, but your heart rate's 10 beats lower. You've adapted to that power, haven't you? Your heart rate's lower, your lactate's hopefully lower as well. That's an adaptation. So we look for the moving factors of all of these things. Now, heart rate is great because you can also train in zones. We look at, you're not training at specific numbers because that gets, it's most of the people, they can't do it. So you have a zone, maybe it's 125 to 140 for your zone 2. You can go out and you can cycle or run and work across different terrains to stay in that zone. You control your gears, control your pace to keep your heart rate where you need it. So zones are really important, and heart rate specifically I like for the total stress that your body is under at a certain intensity.
Would you say that heart rate is sort of a snapshot of what your lactate might be in a world where you can't test every single training session?
Absolutely, yeah. You can look at that. Well, we look at the 2 factors, the heart rate and power on the bike, heart rate and pace on the run, to try and give us accuracy in training. And of course, there's variations in that on a daily basis. That's why you have zones, to be able to work in zones depending on how you feel. And when you look at the 2 factors together, if, for example, today you're in zone 2 heart rate, but your power on the bike is zone 3, That's maybe a positive thing. You feel good, your heart rate's low, but you're producing more power. This is a good day. What about the opposite? A day you're in zone 3 heart rate, but your power's down in zone 2. Things aren't quite as good today as they should be. I've seen those two factors together. I can now judge what to do. Am I tired? Am I getting sick? You make decisions based on what you see of the two things together. So there's lots of factors affecting heart rate. So understanding your own response to training and how that affects heart rate is part of you learning to become a good athlete. I always say it takes an athlete 2 to 3 years to learn how to train. Like to learn how to control heart rate, how to prepare for sessions, how to manipulate their body and their data so they can always stay consistent. That's a learned art.
We do the lactate test, we get the results, then how does that apply to the training?
It's setting up those zones you need so that you know what type of training you need to do. So let's say, and this is generally true, right? There's very few people who don't fit this mold, this idea of 80% endurance training, think below threshold, and 20% of like higher intensity training as a broad strokes, okay? We need to know what easy is for you. We need to know what hard is for you. So the zones are set from your lactate testing on exactly what they are for you at this period in time. So we can then see when we retest what part of your physiology has changed. Okay. So racing is a totally different thing, right? So what we're trying to do, think about this. Think about a cyclist is a great way to look at it, to simplify the whole picture. They'll do long endurance rides to build their aerobic system. They'll do some sustained tempo work, sustained paces to get stronger and hold pace. Specific threshold intervals and climbing, and some out and out sprint fast stuff at its basics. So they do those separate sessions. And then they'll go for a ride and they start to mix it all up, or they'll do an early season race and mix it all up. And so what they're doing is they're bringing all those individual components of fitness together and building the perfect cake, the perfect recipe, so that then everything's working together so they can then peak and go and race. So it's a bit the same with triathlon's a much more complicated sport, but really a great triathlete thinks of a flow from A to B, and that's the start of the swim to the end of the run. It's one flow, it's one effort. And so we look at making that as efficient as possible and knowing what you can sustain on the bike in order to have a great run. A typical thing I get in my lab is that someone comes in and says, hey, you know, my run sucks. I'm really good on the bike. I need to work on my run. And I test them. Their run's great and their bike sucks. And what that means is in a race, they're biking beyond their fitness, beyond their conditioning. So by the time they get to their run, they've got nothing left. So, but in that situation, the lab teaches them, oh my God, I need to change my bike training because my run's actually going really, really well. Or I've had young cross-country runners come in from high school, and the coach will say, oh, Fred's not got a kick. He always gets dropped in the last 800 meters of the race. We need to work on his speed. So they start working on speed with them. I test them and I realize this poor kid, by the time he reaches the last 800 meters of the race, he's full of lactate. He's working way beyond his threshold. He's got nothing left. No wonder he's got no kick. So if we developed him more aerobically rather than speed, then he'd have room for a kick at the end. So the testing takes away all the guesswork and all the theories that humans have and just gives you the science to act on. So for me as a coach, it's the best ever, right? Someone comes into my lab, all the theories, all the stories have gone. Let's test you, see what you present with. Let's interpret it smartly. And then we both know your body has spoken. And we put that into use then. And then all you've got to do is test, prescribe, do it. And that loop, test, prescribe, do it, repeat, goes on and on and on, getting faster, faster all the time. Because there's no stories involved, there's no theories, it's just science.
What's the ideal testing time period? Like how often, how frequent are you doing it? Because I know my last test was, I think, January 2022, which is a long, like 2 years ago, basically. Yeah. And I know for me, because I'm working like a lot of age groupers, and sometimes I'll have a lot of time to train and sometimes I won't have any time. So when I don't have any time, I see my fitness dropping lower. And I just hate to test and see that my fitness has declined, right. You know? So I usually will wait and I'll call you up once I know my fitness has increased from the last test, right. Which I know is not the right way to do it.
And we've proven it with testing.
Yeah. So what is the right way to do it? How often should athletes do this testing?
Look, I test my athletes, age group athletes, every 12 weeks, whether they kind of want to test or not. Pro athletes every 8 weeks, because they do so much more volume of training, you can see adaptations much quicker. And we might also use, like the Norwegians do, lactate testing during training sessions just to make sure that the training session is at the right intensity. And then what I would say to people is, you don't do a test to prove how fit you are. That's a lovely scenario in future tests. You test to show where you're at and what you need to do to get fitter. So you just test regardless. And you build up a picture over time, because you might be surprised at what makes you fitter or makes you worse. Sometimes it's quite amazing. People will go through a phase of, say, base work, and they'll get massive gains from it. And then you put them through really hard speed work, and they'll get no gains from it. Other times it's the exact opposite. People will do a huge period of base training, get no gains, but it somehow lays a platform that when they do the strength and speed work, they do explode and they get really much faster. So you need to know what type of stimulus works for the athletes. That's why you've got to test more often. And also to keep some honesty in the mix so that the athlete can have confidence, which is, hey, I've only been averaging 1.5 runs a week for the last 2 months, but I've managed to hold the fitness I had. That's quite good, isn't it, considering I've been hardly running? So sometimes a win is standing still. So you just got to know where you're at. If you don't know where you're at, you don't know what training to do. And I think you've been a bit of a victim of this, especially with your bike. You've had probably 18 months of training and you've gone like this with your fitness. Yep. So you're back where you were 18 months ago, and we don't know what worked for you or didn't work for you. So the point about testing, it takes away all your theories, all the articles you think you've read. It takes away the idea of trying someone else's training. It tells you what you need to do.
So speaking of what I need to do, the plan is test the swim, which we haven't done before. I'm excited to see how that goes. Then we're going to test the bike and the run, and we'll come back here and discuss the results. So that's the plan?
That's the plan.